I want to talk to you today about pandemic flu. My name is Vinay Gupta and I do science and engineering in the public interest. The first thing to understand is that pandemic flu is a question of risk. Nobody knows for sure if it will come, and if it does come, what form it will take. I'm going to examine a severe but plausible scenario, the 50-50 scenario, in which 50% of the human race is exposed to the flu and 50% of those people die. 1.6 billion people would die in this scenario, 1/4 of the human race. Is this plausible? You have to look at the history to understand it. In 1918, there was a flu that affected approximately 50% of the human race. We call it the Spanish flu. However, only 2% of the people who were infected died, more or less. This is to say, it was roughly 1/25 as dangerous as the flu that we're worrying about. However, in isolated villages where there was little pre-existing immunity to the flu, nearly all of the adults died. This is a picture from Alaska, and these are flu orphans. All of the adults in these villages were just wiped out because there was no pre-existing immunity. The danger is that the current bird flu, H5N1, will affect the entire human population in the same way that the 1918 flu, H1N1, affected these villagers. H5N1 is really dangerous. Right now it's somewhere between 60 and 90% fatal, and the only thing that's protecting us is that it's extremely hard to catch. How likely is it that a strain of H5N1, which is extremely infectious, will arise and it will remain as deadly as it is now? We don't know. Even the virologists are guessing. Some say very likely, some say unlikely, but until it happens, it's very hard to predict. We need to prepare for this scenario. It could happen, and there are things that can be done. There are 3 basic levels of preparation: family, city, and nation. I'm going to run through 5 reasons that we can hope that there are ways that we can effectively respond to this pandemic flu threat. The first is that flus are less prevalent in the summer, and they're less prevalent in hot, moist areas. There is a team led by police that published an article in Public Library of Science indicating that in high humidity, high temperature regimes, flu is almost impossible to catch between mammals. This is what we call the artificial summer scenario, where airports, schools, public buildings all maintain high interior temperature and humidity from the first signs of danger, and this helps to keep pandemic flu transmission down to a minimum. This is something that can be instituted even before the flu strain is genuinely dangerous, so that if there is an infectious outbreak, it will be more likely to be contained. It could, for example, stop the spread of an infection through the global airport network relatively easily compared to other measures that might have the same effect. We should be looking at doing this now. Secondly, it's possible to keep safe by avoiding the contact between human beings, which leads to infection. And this is a many-stage layered process. Masks and gloves for people who are outdoors, staying at home, stockpiling food so that if there's a sudden passage of an infectious agent through your local area, like an outbreak, it's possible for you to stay at home for 2 weeks, a month, 6 weeks, until the viral infection has dropped down in severity, until public health workers have got on top of the situation. This also applies to infrastructure, things like composting toilets, alternate ways of cooking food if there's a grid failure. All of this stuff is in the general domain of keeping people who could infect each other away from each other. Very important, and this is all something that can be prepared ahead of time. We can do this. The survivor reserve is another critical approach to this problem. When you're dealing with a virus which is 50 to 90% fatal, you wind up with potentially tens or hundreds of millions of immune survivors. They've had the flu, they didn't die, they're largely immune to further infection, and they don't pass the virus on in most cases, possibly in all cases. What's needed is research into the science of the medical status of the survivors and a preparation to use these survivors efficiently to protect the rest of us. These are the people who keep the power stations running, who keep the food trucks moving, who do medical care for the people who get sick, and who can be relied upon to keep society functioning through this crisis. The survivor reserve is critical, and we really need to start an international effort to create and maintain this reserve capability. We don't have the survivors yet, but we need to provision everything that they will need in the event that we do need them. Emergency vaccine development is the critical key to this. The only way that a pandemic is genuinely going to be curtailed is if vaccines are developed and deployed. What we need is work on unconventional approaches to doing emergency vaccine development, and there are a lot of things which are not fully funded, which could be. This is an area for experts, but in terms of public policy, really emergency vaccine development it needs to be priority number one in this entire arena. So do what you can to encourage this. Finally, there's the question of food. When you're dealing with an outage of this kind of severity, a quarter of the human population dies, keeping food available is going to be the primary differentiator between regions where you've got low secondary fatalities and regions where an enormous number of people die unnecessarily. There is very little that you can do to ensure food supply globally speaking, but there are a few sort of low-hanging fruit possibilities. The first is stockpiling fertilizer and seed on farms ahead of time. Also diesel fuel in areas where agriculture is mechanized, so that if the fertilizer supply chains break down, if the seed supply chains break down, farmers have at least one harvest worth of the essential requirements for them to continue farming. The second thing is that there are an enormous number of cows and pigs and other food animals across America, across Europe, and across South America and some other parts of the world. And in a crisis, initial calculations show that there's enough caloric reserve, there's enough food on the hoof to keep America fed for roughly 6 months, and it's a little less for Europe and South America. The trick is that you need to be able to move your beef cattle close to the cities so that in the event of an infrastructure breakdown, the food is available to the people in the cities who need it. And this is no small matter. Moving 100 million cows close to urban population centres is a huge undertaking, and it's not something that can be done when the flu is at full swing. This is something that needs to be prepared ahead of time, and at the first sign of really serious pandemic problems, the cows are moved, or possibly they're moved anyway. I can't stress too much that ensuring food security is a very large, very serious and largely unsolved problem, but it's not insoluble by nature, it's just that it hasn't been seriously attacked at the level of thinking required to keep the food going in a 50-50 scenario. So I really want to stress this. Food security is critical, there's a lot that can be done, but we need to get moving on this. Finally, I want to end on a note of hope. We're an extremely tough race. Human beings have survived pandemic after pandemic after pandemic. Large populations in the past 1,000 years have been wiped out by pandemics. North America and South America were extremely heavily hit by the diseases brought by Europeans. Smallpox was a huge issue, but the human race survives. Even in the worst of these scenarios, where 50% of the human race is infected and 50% die, 4.8 billion human beings will survive. We're a tough race. Pandemic flu could be extremely uncomfortable for a few years, but 2 or 3 decades after the event, it would be a distant memory for the survivors, which is 75% of the human race. So we can do this. It is not necessarily easy, but it is possible.